Here's a story that I like that I converted into green text format. Be me. Work for US government. Say used to because don't know what'll happen now. Didn't have glitzy office job. More of a field agent. Military, but not quite. Not going into intricacies of branch or specific work. Irrelevant, you probably wouldn't want to know. Doubt if you'll want to know this either. Story needs to get out. Dealing with something nobody understands. We're supposed to understand everything. Drilling rig in Kalahari desert? You're not supposed to know about it. Middle of nowhere, nobody could stumble upon it. Barely knew shit when called up for the mission. FBI started investigation June 2013. Some anomalous event occurred. Rundown of what we were told, hostage situation. Few workers went crazy, holding others at gunpoint. No explicit reason, assumed desert madness. What we were told. Job, diffuse the situation. Try not to kill anybody. Key word, try. No guarantees. Any old SWAT team could have handled it. Dealing with petroleum engineers, not trained militia. Place confidential, non-essential personnel barred. Barely made the cut as essential. In retrospect, should have asked more questions. Questions like why so secretive? Why 36 men needed for what small squadron could do? Truth is, after a while, you stop caring. But this time changed everything. Can't just write this off. Flew out in 3 aircrafts, 12 people each. Recognized Klaus and Buchanan on mine. Others were strangers, didn't matter. Goal, get in, finish the job, get out. Journey took a while, expected. What I saw when we got there. Not expected. Rig and buildings not spectacular on surface. Located on edge of huge ass cliff. Buchanan, kinda defeats the purpose of a rig, doesn't it? Place extended down into cliff. Stairs, ladders, elevators, tunnels. Entrance, small, gated building leading to stairs. Plan, place too tight for 36 people at once. Split into 3 groups of 12. First group runs into trouble, send second. If second fails, third steps in. Ideally, second and third not necessary. I was part of second. Not taking it seriously. Dealing with batshit workers with basic weapons. First group likely to waste perpetrators if rowdy. They wouldn't need us. Some guys in squad felt same. Klaus found beers in cabin. Finished them off while supervisors weren't looking. After 2 hours, told to head down. Stood in disbelief, supervisors barked to stir reaction. We complied, had to. Implications heavy, 12 trained men couldn't finish job. We were expendables in unknown situation. Glad we had beers for nerves. At entrance, Supervisor Richter opened metal gate. Poured into reception area. Small space, few desks, filing cabinets, metal vault-like barrier. Richter entered code into panel, barrier opened. Faced with blackness. Flicked on rifle lights, descended steps. Light bulbs above not working. Steps branched every 50 meters, kept going straight. Richter, keep going down. After 20 minutes, reached lab/control room mix. Monitors, scientific instruments haphazardly set. Lights here, breathing loosened. Richter told us to be quiet, move to back door. Sheer silence. Richter's expression plummeted, motioned us over. Whispered, keep your guard up. Extreme reservation in air, followed orders. Richter slowly opened door. Should have expected what we saw. Couldn't stop gagging. Seen death, but not like this. First team lying limp, gory mess. Bullet holes too large, like 50-calorie sniper. Who'd snipe in close proximity? Assumed not dealing with rig employees. Superiors lied or out of loop. Leaning towards former. Richter signaled halt. Couldn't be mad, he looked terrified. Motioned to enter hallway. Moved with caution, minimal noise. Tried not to disrupt bodies. Hallway branched, always went straight. Reached large, rusted metal door. Marked, inspection zone, maximum clearance needed. Another panel with fingerprint scanner. Looked at Richter for next move. Richter entered password, scan thumb. Braced for whatever was coming. Couldn't be prepared. Deafening alarm, flashing red lights. Metal barrier opened, massacre followed. Barrage of ammunition decimated group. Near back, didn't get full brunt. No way in hell to return fire, futile. Brief glimpse of attackers before bolting. Assumed infantry unit, more advanced. Shiny gray exosuits, precise movements. Weapons barely yielding recoil. Ran other way, ducked into branched pathway. Weaved around maze of corridors. Gunshots ceased, only my footsteps. Alive, but lost. Stopped, leaned against wall, catching breath. Nearly had heart attack, metal hand covered mouth. One of those soldiers. Instinctively put hands up, please don't kill me. Soldier's helmet retracted, revealed face. Looked at each other for eternity. Blank face, subtle surprise. Familiar somehow. After silence, he chuckled, never thought I'd get this chance. Initial shock wore off, tried pestering with questions. Words stumbled out incoherent. It's all right. He stopped me. Long story, but I'll explain everything. Looked around, continued, hopefully we have enough time. What he told me was incredible. Soldiers came from future, 2143. Time travel. They came to stop us from reaching inspection zone. What was beyond the point? Something primal. Never meant to be disturbed. Bunch of theories, same conclusion. Cannot mess with it. We dug into cliffside, ruined future. Released something. Soldier sighed, took a seat. You weren't the only ones that messed up. We did too. Chaotic aftermath, time travel expedited. Needed to erase event immediately. First team of 15 sent back to winter 2014. Stop it before it started. Technology not ready. Accidentally dropped June 2013. Wait, June 2013 when it started. Looked at soldier, he nodded. Catastrophically messed everything up. Thought more, couldn't be. First team dropped, triggered event. Seismic or radiation spike caught US attention. Pod with water, rations dropped 400 miles away. All died in desert. Trying to stop discovery caused it. Predestination, I whispered. Soldier nodded. Self-fulfilling prophecy. Doesn't make sense to me, but I didn't help design that time machine. What did we release? What are you guys protecting? Chuckles, sneers, not protecting that thing. Protecting humanity. Need it dormant. Wakes up naturally, we're done. But we can't cause it. Still don't understand, pressed further. Why you here now? It's 2018, machine mess up again? Soldier nods. Needed to be sent back after discovery. Landed a few days ago. What now? I asked. Sheer disconcertion on his face. Kill everybody that comes here. Employees, investigators. Heart drops, feel anger. Realized why necessary. 100 lives today to save humanity. Close to drilling into beast's lair. No time to convince you to stop. Only 15 of us. In our timeline, initially disrupted end of year. Saw creature, decided not to provoke further. Too late. Woke up 124 years later, escaped. No time. No time. Cautious, asked, why didn't you kill me? Looked at me, extended gaze. Eyes familiar, strange at time. Reached into pocket, took out Polaroid. Slid it to me. Me holding baby, mid-30s. Stared back, expected explanation. He chuckled, family never blamed you. Ancestors felt shame, but we knew you were following orders. Didn't realize what you were doing. Processing revelation, soldier got up. Kill you, I won't exist. Selfish reason, but survival. What do I do now? I asked, nearly choking. Find way out. Staircases lead up. Surface, try to tell others, but won't believe. Forget about this. Must have looked horrified. Soldier chuckled, don't worry. We have plan, confident it'll work. Hold you off for a few more days. Smiled, activated helmet. Walked, turned back, would have told more, no time. Sat there, hands shaking. Stood up, found stairs. Stairs felt like eternity. Didn't encounter anyone. Reached surface, only thing on mind. We've been living on borrowed time.
I was 8 years old. I remember waking up in my parents' bed. I must have fell asleep on the couch downstairs and been carried up to bed, but all I remember is laying there alone. The hall light was on, and I heard the TV on downstairs, so I thought my parents were still down there watching TV, so I enjoyed the huge bed to myself, their heavy thick duvet covering me, freshly made bed I could stretch out in. But there was a lump in the bed next to me, and it shifted a bit as I stretched out. I remember it moving. I just thought it was the dog, so I moved my little toes towards it under the covers, but when they reached the lump, it was nothing but cold, like ice against the sole of my foot. I snatched it back quickly. Whatever was making the lump in the bed slid off the other side. I heard nothing, but felt the cover being pulled as it moved, and I was frozen. What was in the bed with me? And does it know I'm aware? I lay there for an eternity, ears open and my breathing light, trying to hear whatever it was on the floor, or was it under the bed? Was it waiting for me to move? I was so quiet, I could hear the TV clearly now. There was no show on, just a high-pitched ringing. The TV channel had ended for the night, so why were my parents not in bed? I sat up in bed, slowly, quietly, trying to disturb the huge bed as little as possible. I pulled the covers away so I could make the jump from the bed to the light of the hall. I could run downstairs and get my parents. I could make it. So I stood on the bed, and I jumped. I ran so fast down the stairs. I ran into the living room and I saw them. My parents were frozen, staring at the TV, eyes open, mouths open, frozen still, and I could feel it behind me, at the top of the stairs, looking at me. I turned around and all I could see was its huge black glass eyes. All I could hear was the TV. When I woke up I was outside my house. My parents thought I was sleepwalking. They don't remember putting me to bed though.
Back in the 80s. I have a temp job working as an archaeologist for the Bureau of Land Management in Lander, Wyoming. Lander didn't have a lot to do. So one weekend I drive to Casper. Hey, bars that don't play only country western music. Spend most of Saturday chatting with a hottie. Bar closes, but things don't go the way I would have liked with the hottie. Get in the car, start driving back to Lander. Bad decision. It's really late and I'm pretty tired. Eventually, I decide it would be smart to pull off the highway and get some sleep. A hotel isn't really an option, that part of the world is barely populated. End up in a rest area. I pull right into a parking spot, set the brake, and go to sleep. Note the pull right into the parking spot. That'll be important. Later on, I'm jolted away by the sensation of my car rocking. I assume I'm rolling and grab for the parking brake, but it's set. The car stops rocking. I get out. It's a clear night with a full moon. Looking around, I notice something weird. Remember how I pulled straight into a parking spot? The problem is I'm now pointed the wrong way. I would have had to back in when I parked. My car is flipped 180 degrees. I get back in my car. I'm wide awake and there's no point in trying to get some sleep. So I get back on the road and drive all the way to Lander. Over the next few days, I consider my options. Earthquake? There was none recorded, and it sure seems unlikely that one would have so precisely relocated my car. Some drunk local boys screwing with an out-of-stater? Maybe, but they sure would have had to clear out in a hurry after I got out of my car. There was no sign of anybody. Somebody slipped something into my drink when I was in that bar? Actually, that seemed the most likely, but I had no other symptoms beside that event in the rest area. Shrug it off as that was weird and get on with my life. But the next week or so is strange. Things I knew I completed at work were still pending. The boss recalls conversations with me that I don't remember. There are some new people in the office that I don't remember seeing before, but others say have been there for years. Likewise, some folks I knew at the office weren't there any longer and nobody else remembered them. I don't think I'm in the same universe that I lived in for my first 20-some years.
Exploring local dump with a friend. People leave free stuff there sometimes. There's a swap shed. He shows me the area behind dump where people stash things from the dump to pick up later. Friend is a salvage expert, has a travel trailer in area behind dump where he stays occasionally. Winding heavily forested wide trails full of large abandoned machinery, stashed for metal salvage. He shows me all the prime picks we can come back for later. There is a mannequin at the dump entrance he refers to as Paula. Says if you want to take anything you must first ask Paula. Area is highly contaminated, unlivable. When I see something I want, I know instinctively to think of the mannequin and ask if I can have it, and I will have my answer. Explore and chat for a couple hours, check out cool abandoned things strewn alongside the trails, abandoned encampments. As we are exploring, darkness falls. We stop by friend's travel trailer to grab some salvage using my phone flashlight. As we are walking out of the winding network of wide forested trails behind the dump, friend nods his head in the direction of a trail we didn't go down. I look down that trail and see the real Paula. Paula is surrounded by atmospheric distortion. Sitting with her knees in front of her, hunched over, arms wrapped around her knees. Completely naked. Emaciated, extra long arms, extra long legs. Pale white eyes, pale white hair long enough to spread along the ground behind her and beside her legs, pale white skin. Paula raises her head as I look at her. Get the feeling I should not gawk at Paula and continue to follow my friend back to the exit of the trails where my car is parked. Just as we are returning to my car, look back, in the trail leading away from Paula is now blocked off with a large glowing tent, perhaps a 12-man. Get back in car, take friend home and go to bed. Thanks for the stuff, Paula.
When I was 6, I had a nightmare about this shadow person, and he looked like this. He slowly crept up to the foot of my bed. He extended his long, dark arm and slowly lowered it down on my face. I heard his slow, faint breathing. His blank, emotionless face slowly turned into a smile. He lowered his head onto mine. I felt his warm breath. He slowly inserted his fingers inside my mouth. I was too frightened to move. I tried to call my parents, but my voice was too muffled for them to hear. I instantly turned on my lamp and all of a sudden he was gone. To this day I have no idea whether he was a real shadow person, or just some sick child molesting predator in a dark costume. I'll never know.
In university. Living in dorm. Have roommate. Our beds are placed right beside one another with a divider in the middle. One night I go to bed, BC have to wake up early for an exam. Roommate out partying with GF that night. Hear from behind the divider what sounds like the roommate let out a huge sigh as if he was holding his breath in for an hour or so. Pay not attention to it. Wake up and Hess not there. What did I hear? Go to the exam. Get back from exam later that day. RA is at my door and tells me the roommate was choked to death last night. Asked if I knew anything.
be in a shitty life and financial position, watching Turner Classic Films just out of morbid interest. Liking donkey skin, it's fine. In the middle of the movie, while the protagonist sings a song about how screwed she is if she's found wearing the skin, I hear a crack of lighting and my mother's laughter at a high point in the music right when I was thinking about how suicide might be on the table. My mother had a distinct laugh, as she had a high-pitched voice and a strong New Jersey accent, so her laughter is ingrained in my mind, as while she was rather short, making her difficult to stop in crowds, she was very loud, so obviously her voice was ingrained in my skull. While she was very cheerful and I had a great, stable childhood, as she got older she gained a mean streak influenced by alcohol and her own issues, mostly related to her own relatives, so had a mean streak and she laughed when she was disgusted or angry as well, and because of my failure to launch until my mid-20s our relationship got strained. The laugh I heard was something in between a normal long laugh from her, and also oozed meanness. I rewinded the TV, it had no sign of her voice in the audio. I never unalived myself and sort of moved on to better pasture, but the cruelty in the voice is what I remember still. I don't know what she was laughing at, really. Was she laughing at me, or was she laughing at something I can't understand yet? I have never seen a ghost and I have never experienced a similar event in my life. It truly sounded like my mother's laughter mixed in with the orchestra's music, during a scene where the protagonist is speaking with peasants, again, about how they need to chance her life.
I am a 75-year-old, who not only has had close encounters with UFOs but I came face to face with 2 of the occupants when I was aged 19. Another nutcase many might remark, if not to my face rest assured, I have after all no witness to that encounter that took place here in the UK as my brother Dennis departed these shores to live in Australia in 1969. He would however attest to that which took place 10 years earlier on the first Sunday of January 1959 because he shared that terrifying encounter with me. My family members are fully aware of what my brother Den and I experienced that traumatic early morning hour. Because I have reiterated that account of that mind-blowing experience countless times since. It happened at approximately 0200 hours when Den and I were en route home along the A3 route from Portsmouth, on Dennis's 125cc BSA Bantam motorcycle. He had taken our younger brother, Rob, back to his Royal Marine barracks near Portsmouth. Both Rob and I were serving in the Royal Marines and our 2 weeks Christmas leave had overlapped one another's by 1 week, his leave commencing 1 week prior to mine. I had taken Rob's railway warrant, which I was entitled to as a fellow Royal Marine, to meet both brothers at Portsmouth and Southsea Railway Station, Dennis having taken Rob there on the pillion of his motorbike. My intention was to say goodbye to Rob at the station and then to return home with Dennis. I had little else to do and I welcomed the ride and the company. I remember that neither brother was at the station when I arrived there and I had to wait some time before Den turned up. His motorbike had incurred a front tire puncture, although I have a feeling that I was late arriving at Portsmouth and Southsea Railway Station through some delay or other. When I at last met up with Den he told me that Rob had continued onward to his barracks as he had to be there by 3 minutes to midnight. Thus, I mounted the pillion of Den's motorbike well after midnight and very soon we left Portsmouth far behind. I remember that it was bitter cold and I clung behind my brother's body to shield myself from that bitter cold air. I wore only a light, blue summer jacket and light fawn summer trousers. Aside from my uniform I possessed a few civilian clothes. Thus we rode along the A3. I was silent, alone with thoughts of my own return to my RM barracks a week later. Conversing was out of the question. Even shouting loudly was ineffective in the slipstream as we sped along. The whole route was bereft of traffic and eventually we found ourselves riding around the perimeter of the Devil's Punch Bowl at Hindhead. At one point, as we were almost about to leave the bowl behind, so Den suddenly steered the motorbike onto the grass and the engine cut. Problem? Dennis assured me there wasn't a problem but that it was a good spot to take a breather and to spend a penny. So we stood there on the swathe of grass overlooking the deep bowl-shaped valley stretching away before us. The sounds of the wind and of the motorbike engine took several minutes to disperse from our ears, and it was good to get some respite from that bitter cold wind. Then, as the ghost sound of wind and engine dispersed, so we noticed a strange sound emanating from down in the punch bowl itself. A sound impossible to describe, except maybe that it was almost musical to the ears, like the azdic of a submarine, and yet at the same time really nothing like it. We had never heard such a weird sound before, and there was nothing with which to otherwise compare it. Puzzled and exceedingly curious, we elected to make our way down into the punch bowl to discover the source of that mysterious sound. There was an initial very steep slope of maybe 30 feet or so that we were obliged to descend on our backsides. Then, with Den leading the way, we were able to continue on downwards along a barely discernible but more gently descending track. How long we were making our way steadily deeper, I don't know, but we were quite a long way down there, and to me the weird musical sound was becoming ever more mysterious and much louder as we came closer to its source. What's more, as we drew closer to that source, I developed a strong sense of unease that persisted as we proceeded. Soon afterwards Den stopped abruptly and turned to me to express that he had a bad feeling, and added, "I think we should turn back." Looking back in the direction of whence we had come, I could see that we had in fact traveled an uncomfortable distance away, and in hushed tones I readily agreed with my brother that maybe we should indeed turn back. Literally at that precise moment, before we had even turned around, there came a sudden momentary silence as that weird sound abruptly ceased. What occurred next is equally difficult to describe. There was a sound, almost like that of displaced air. I can explain it no better than that. Then, this sound rose vertically into the air, very close to where we stood. We both dropped to the ground instinctively in an effort to silhouette the object against that brilliant backdrop of stars, but we saw nothing, even though we were able to follow the path of travel by the strange sound it was emitting. It appeared to travel somehow away to our right and then swooped back around to head back towards us. The terrific crash that ensued as it struck the ground was deafening and ought to have been heard as far away as Guildford. My thoughts at that time, it had me comparing it to that of a large airliner crash landing. There then followed the distinct loud sound of scrub being flattened in its path as it seemed to skid along under the inertia of its descent, and then to finally come to a stop some little distance, maybe 20 to 30 feet in front of us. I clearly have, etched into my mind, a distinct memory of the noise of thin branches or scrub scraping along an obviously metallic fuselage, followed by the final scraping sound as that branch broke free. A flying object of some sort had come to a halt. I stood staring at the bushes from where the sound of that crash landing had come. We had seen nothing, and yet this flying object, by the very sound it made as it hit the ground, indicated a large, exceedingly heavy if invisible craft, and in my head the word UFO was at the forefront. Then, almost immediately my attention was drawn to something approaching us from the direction that the UFO had landed. I stared ahead, my mind struggling to believe what was actually taking place. Then it emerged. I will describe what we saw, as best to my memory as possible, for I was overcome by a feeling of sheer terror. This figure stood some 8 to 10 feet tall. It appeared to glide rather than to walk. It also appeared to be floating some 2 feet or so off the ground. It stopped in front of me, so close that I could have touched it. I was literally paralyzed with fear, an adrenaline rush so great that it had an opposite effect, and I stood there transfixed, unable to move. Then, a second figure identical to the first, glided out from the same direction and stood to the left of the first one, as viewed from my position. Both figures seemed to be floating off the ground and had seemed to glide. The body seemed composed of some sort of black material that was convoluted, with like lengthwise folds. The head was encased in an elongated glass helmet, and where the eyes would be was a single, large round-shaped green eye or light. Today I would liken it to a large LED, light-emitting diode, but I am not so sure such devices existed at that time. Mercifully, I felt, I could not see the features behind the glass, but I had an uncanny and distinct feeling that I wouldn't want to see behind the glass anyway. I am unable to clearly describe my feelings except for one thought within the sheer terror that overwhelmed me. This cannot be happening, but it is. Amazingly, thoughts of those in government would not believe what is happening to me right now, but they are fast asleep in their beds and not here in this punch bowl with me, seeing what I am seeing. I clearly recall those thoughts. I seem to remember something else, a sickly odor. Was this the odor of fear, or did it come from those two aliens? I truthfully do not know. Such thoughts were fleeting, coming to me in a moment of utmost terror. My second thought was of the sudden need to look at another human being, and almost in slow motion and with great concentration of effort I managed to turn my head left to look at my brother. Why left when he had been standing on my right? I'm at a loss to explain that one. The two aliens stood a mere few feet away, within touching distance. Utilizing all my concentration, I slowly, so very slowly and mechanically managed to turn my head to look upon my brother. A second shock now struck me as I saw that I was standing there alone. The shock of this realization galvanized my hitherto paralyzed body into sudden action and turned my body to face the direction that I was facing, for the thought came to me that if I looked back at them again I would not escape. I then ran. That headlong, terror-stricken flight was like a nightmare in itself, because I was expecting to be seized from behind. My thought was that I would surely not be allowed to escape after what I had just witnessed. I had no sense of direction at all. I remember only that my one and only desperate thought was to put as much distance between me and them and as possible. I ran, seemingly blindly, and I could plainly hear high-pitched screaming as I ran. Those screams seemed to be apart from me, but may well have come from me, I truly don't know. All I remember was that headlong, panic-stricken flight as running in a nightmare, and the full expectancy that I would not be allowed to escape. The next image as I ran so blindly was of finding myself inexplicably at the base of the 30-foot steep incline that we had initially descended. How did I, in that panic-stricken flight, manage to find my way back to where we had descended into the punch bowl? I was and am unable to explain that one either. There, ahead of me and scrambling up that steep incline, was my brother. I had caught up with him, and in later years he told me that he was on a rise before reaching that incline, and that when he looked back to check that I was with him he saw to his horror that I was still standing at the original spot with two aliens clearly seen towering over me. By the time he had scaled that steep incline, I had caught him up. He must have seen me but seconds before I had turned and fled. As a very fit, young Royal Marine, and at the same time fueled with sheer panic, I can answer that one quite clearly. As we feverishly tried to climb that steep incline so we would slip back down a foot for every 3 we made upwards. Eventually we made the top. Den mounted his motorbike, kick-started it, and I leapt onto the pillion, and away we sped in great haste. Even as we rode at speed along that road I was half expecting to be seized and pulled off that motorbike, and I clung tenaciously, my arms around my brother's waist. I remember that just before we reached the city of Guildford, 11 miles on, Den pulled over and cut the engine. A tall, long ash fence lay close to us, and against this we dropped onto our haunches, unable to believe what had happened and how we had escaped a fate worse than death. I remember nothing more after collapsing against that fence. I haven memory of arriving home, not even of the rest of my leave. I do not to this day remember returning to my barracks, nor of the intense training that followed. I have hitherto told no one outside of the family of our experience at the punch bowl that never to be forgotten night. Strangely, I never forgave my brother for deserting me down there. For 3 years I had no contact with him. Then, I heard that my brother was in an isolation hospital at Feltham, where he lived, and that he was in a serious condition. Dennis had contracted hepatitis C, and relenting, I went to visit him. What I saw shocked me and totally melted my anger. Den looked like a skeleton with yellow skin drawn over it. He was badly jaundiced and had almost died. A priest had closed his eyes when Den suddenly opened them, and the nurse had screamed. It had been a very close call. It was years later that Den explained that he had thought I was behind him when he ran. Only on reaching high ground had he turned to look back and saw that I was not with him but was standing there still with those two beings towering over me. His only thought then was to escape and to report what had happened. Luckily for me, I managed to just catch him up before he gained the top of that steep incline, above which his motorbike was parked. It was all of a 30 miles journey back to where I lived. Besides, poor Den would no doubt have been taken for psychiatric observation. Or charged with possible murder associated with my disappearance. Do I believe in aliens? Do I what? Oh yes, they exist for sure. You won't find them when you are in the pub, watching TV or fast asleep in your bed, although I must hesitate here because I have since read of abductions of hitherto sleeping persons. There was something else that is relevant to this true story. When I finally talked with Dennis and asked him outright, "Why did you desert me down there?" He told me it was those small creatures with red eyes that had almost formed a circle around you. There were hundreds of them. I never thought I would see you again. I had not seen these red-eyed creatures, but then, I had not been looking back. Many years later, on desolate Dartmoor in Devonshire, late one night, on the northern moor out of Oakhampton, was a strange arc of brilliant white light. Another brother, Jim, and his teenage son and daughter were with us. We decided to look closer at this strange arc of bright white light behind a high rocky tor. The road to that part of the moor was narrow, too narrow to reverse turn, and so would necessitate continuing a few miles further to the tiny roundabout or donut to come back on our own. After driving along this narrow road, flanked on either side by a steep drop onto a boulder-strewn moor for some miles, I began to feel a strong sense of apprehension, a strange feeling of danger, my sixth sense at work. This feeling had barely been with me for long when Brother Jim suggested that we should turn back because he felt it was dangerous to continue. However, I had spotted something else, something that made my heart race. I saw literally hundreds if not thousands of pairs of red eyes. Those red eyes did not belong to animals because no animal was capable of such speed and able to traverse that boulder-strewn terrain and the deep craters littering the North Moor, especially at night, besides which the number of those pairs of red eyes was vast. My blood ran cold as I remembered what Den had seen at the Punch Bowl, red eyes exactly what we were seeing there now on that moor. And without doubt were seeking to surround us. Keeping my mounting panic and concern to myself, I heard Jim again express his concern at continuing, and I responded with mounting anger due to fear and frustration that I could not bloody well turn around as the road was far too narrow and too high above the moor for the wheels to reach the ground once the wheels left the road. I felt that we had no choice but to continue on to that small roundabout or donut that I estimated was about 4 miles further on. I was driving a MK 1601 Ford Consul and Brother Jim asked to get out to see if there was a place we could do a reverse turn. All too soon he called out, "Here Brian, you can reverse here." I replied, "Are you sure, Jim?" I had doubts, in that the drop appeared to be too deep. He assured me that it was okay. The rapidly moving red eyes had by now spread out ahead of us, crossed over the road, and having split into two vast groups either side of that road, both were rushing speedily in our direction as if to encircle us. Where had I heard this before? It was Dennis and the Punch Bowl saga all over again. Thousands of them it seemed to me to be. Now I knew it was vital that we escaped. The memory of the Punch Bowl left little doubt in my mind as to what those red eyes were, what they belonged to. Trying hard to control the fast-rising panic within me, I shakily expressed my doubts that the drop was too deep and would plant the car on its chassis before the wheels contacted the ground. "No, it's okay." Jim's words were hardly convincing, but by now close to panic myself, I drove slowly, turning the steering wheel hard over to greatly affect the reverse turn, and trusting Jim's observation, I put the gear into reverse and backed the car slowly off the road. A sudden crash ensued and the wheels, it was rear-wheel drive, spun above the surface of the ground. We were now completely trapped and helpless. Jim and Jimmy got out of the car and went to the rear. Christine was sitting behind me as her dad and brother were trying to lift the car back onto the road, without success. I had seldom experienced such fear as I sat there helplessly watching those rapidly speeding entities that would soon have encircled and been upon us. No one else in my car had yet seen them. Jim and his son were trying to lift the rear of that 1600cc Ford Consul back onto the road. Jim was a brawny, a strong fellow, but all that he and his son achieved was to lift the car only so far a little way off its suspension. The wheels, however, remained firmly on the ground. The idea fleetingly entered my head to get out and to run those 9 miles back to Oakhampton, but how when those things were so fleetingly fast? Besides which, I couldn't leave Christine, and whatever happened we were not capable of traveling 9 miles on foot to escape those rapidly speeding beings. Then, as Jim was trying without success to lift the car, Christine suddenly glanced over to her right, saw the hundreds of red eyes pouring like a flood down that sloping terrain towards us, screamed loudly, "What are those? What are those?" Her loud scream signaled for the movement of the car on its springs to momentarily cease. Obviously Jim had paused to see what had frightened his daughter. This was then followed by the sudden and unbelievable lifting of the car bodily in such a way as to slew it around at the same time so that it was facing our escape route out of there. Jim and Jimmy dived into the car and opened the throttle. I drove out of that place like the proverbial bat out of hell. I could scarcely believe our lucky escape. It is said that fear can induce enormous reserves of strength in a crisis, and that is what happened with Jim. I drove as fast as was safely possible on that narrow road that night, and upon reaching the top of a hill, some mile or two further on, I stopped the car, engine left running, got out and looked back, Jim likewise. For several seconds we saw nothing, but then, there they were, those 2 vast swarms of red eyes pursuing us, on both sides of that road. I don't exaggerate their numbers, to me that seemed to run in hundreds if not thousands. They appeared to me to be small in stature, that was my impression because it was dark. They certainly traveled at speed over a very dangerous and rough terrain with many deep craters and strewn boulders. After about 5 stops, atop a hill, a precaution in the event that the car stalled and it would not restart, we would coast down. Each time we stopped and looked back so a minute or so would pass, then suddenly, there they were, continuing their pursuit of us. On the last hill I was able to see the lights of Oakhampton ahead of us, on our right. We stopped here and again looked back. This time, however, we saw nothing more of those red-eyed creatures. Whether you believe my true narrative I leave with you. I can but sincerely express that it happened as I have recorded it. As a reluctant ufologist, I have written of this alien encounter quite some time ago. It was not published on the site I sent it to, neither was it even acknowledged. I wrote it out of sincere interest and possibly in the hope of eliciting a similar experience from others who may be experiencing an extraterrestrial identical to mine. For what it's worth, I have made pilgrimage to that same area several times since, without success except for 2 occasions when I heard that same musical sound fly over not so far overhead, just above tree height. In fact, nothing was visible, although the sound indicated it had passed over the top of the tall pine trees through which our path led. My car, borrowed from my younger brother, was parked some half-mile away at a car park off the A3, and unable to contain my excitement as my brother said to me, "Brian, I have never doubted your story, but hearing that sound for myself, well, it is certainly not of this world." I suggested we return to the car, have a much-needed coffee to steady our nerves, grab the portable excuse for a tape recorder, a tinny Woolworth job, and endeavor to capture the weird sound. We made it to the car park and to the coffee when suddenly brilliant lights lit up the car from behind. A tap on the window and I saw a policeman accompanied by a special. I wound the window down. He asked, "What are you doing here?" My short fuse at this offensive intrusion, along with my irate words to the effect that it was a free country and to clear off, well, clear was not exactly the word I used, did not go down well, because a second patrol car arrived and my brother and I were handcuffed and incarcerated in separate cells at Godalming police station. How could we explain that we were UFO hunting? The police cells that we spent 6 hours in being infinitely the better alternative to a mental hospital. This incarceration was due to the copper opening the boot of the car and discovering a 12-bore shotgun that I had placed there, intending to shoot rabbits the following morning. I was accused of being Harry Roberts, the guy who had shot a policeman dead, although this man was already in police custody in 1966. Raymond and I were released at 0600 hours the following morning, without charge. I have had other experiences of UFOs, one of which was no rest distance away out at sea off Brighton in Sussex. It made no sound, gave the undoubted impression of being immense in size, and moved slowly and silently just above the sea, emerging from a fog bank on the west side to vanish silently into the fog bank on the east side. It was followed then by a second, identical saucer-shaped UFO with a beehive-like dome on top and small portholes around the circumference of the body. Time being 0500 hours. I had been sea fishing at the time of the occurrence. I also had a frightening experience whilst under canvas at that same seaside resort of Brighton. But that, as they say, is another story.
Be me. Walking in woods. Really pretty day, sun's out and autumn's coming. On the trail when suddenly have to piss. No one's around, screw it. Go up to tree and unleash a nice torrent of piss. Feels good, man. Wait. Why are my legs warm? Wake up in bed. Pissed in my sleep. The horror.
Story I heard from my grand-uncle. Man has seen some weird shit over the years, some of which I've also seen. This is one of the more subtle stories, but still gives me the chills. Be grand-uncle. Vacation in Tuscany. Get to this cozy cottage-style Airbnb. Nice view, comfortable place, but missing one bed. Decides to take one for the team and sleep on couch. That night, lying on couch getting ready to sleep. Hears sound coming from past doorway leading to kitchen. Assume it's one of my aunts or something. Something still feels off, so squints at the doorway. Watches as a figure walks past the doorway. Old man, pale as hell. Permanent, shit-eating grin plastered on his face. Screw this. MP3. Short of losing his shit, kinda hunkers down and starts praying as last resort. Eventually falls asleep. Grand-uncle never brings this up for the rest of the stay at the Airbnb. Eventually we're about to leave. He asks the owner, an elderly lady, about it. The face when she says it was probably her husband. The face when said husband has been dead for the past decade.
While I was in the Marine Corps, we would be stalked by these Bigfoot creatures at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. It didn't matter how many of us were out there. We were armed with rifles and no ammo and or blanks during field ops. They would pick up whatever trash or snacks we would drop. We sometimes could see their eyes in the tree line and see random glimmers of shadows through our night optics. But, you can see outlines and or someone's figure. I mean, like stuff that was used probably during the early 2000s and they were monocular. We would hear knocks or rustling throughout our nights around Verona Loop training grounds or on Camp Lejeune. Many of us who spent time in the infantry spend about 45 to 60% of the year in the woods. You could hear them at night. One night I was doing patrol ops in the woods/hills and we decided to take a pause. It was around 3 a.m. and we were taking a nap break. It was during a war game and I was on watch with one of my buddies. Holding security, we saw an outline in the woods and meanwhile, we were sleep deprived, not thinking we were seeing real things in the tree line till we talked to each other to confirm what we were seeing through our nods. Pebbles were being thrown at us and we were confused, thinking we were about to be run up on by OPFOR, opposition force. So we wake up our guys slowly thinking we're about to be ambushed. Turns out we were being stalked. We decided to get into defensive positions and the rocks kept coming, thinking we were being messed with by the advisors running around overwatching the war game. We checked on the radio if there were any nearby. None. None at all. So we thought it was OPFOR. We opened up with blanks. But, as we opened up we saw a massive creature and another one about 25 to 30 meters away. The creatures knocked over a semi-thin tree and gave a deep growl. Something that would shake guys who were desensitized and not really scared by anything. When daylight came we circled back to look and we found huge footprints. We were so confused and shaken. After that situation, we didn't know how to explain what we saw or experienced. That night I became an actual believer. I was always skeptical about Bigfoot or some creature being in the woods. It was about 5 years ago. To this day I struggle to go into the woods.
I have a lot of real stories with multiple witnesses. I've told these stories many times here and I'm pretty hurt none of you cared to save them. I'll go in chronological order of what I've witnessed my entire life. While I love in the woods stories, I've only experienced one spooky thing from the woods. The majority were found in houses. I think fakers cannot understand the things that go bump in the night feed on our fear and are drawn to us. Or if they are a human spirit, they hang around like unwanted squatter bastards. Piss Native American ghosts. Be me. Be 8. Parents divorced and I moved with mom into a trailer. Feel like I am watched. For some reason can't stop imaging a crowd of around 5 to 10 men dressed like Native Americans glaring at me when I'm alone in my bedroom. Depression hits hard from parents' divorce plus fear in my room, my only safe space I hide in because my mother won't talk shit about my dad. Cry in closet. Have always been scared of the dark but I only sensed the spirits by my bedroom door and felt safe in the closet of all places. Used to be in the old house before I was terrified of the dark and especially the closet. In the closet I felt peace like I was hiding from them. Very Christian and have 10 Bibles gifted by other people. Don't know what to do about the ghosts except make a ring of Bibles around my bed at night and try to sleep. The crowd is always there in my room glaring. The Bibles gave me peace and comfort but didn't drive the ghosts away. Mom didn't notice shit because of neglect and because she was dealing with emotionally recovering from the divorce. She goes to me one day and tells me a neat thing she just learned. Our trailer was built on land that used to be owned by a Native American tribe. She shows me a black and white photo of men in traditional Native American clothing. No, there was no aha moment. I was a pretty oblivious and quiet child. Thought to self, oh that's neat as I looked at the photo. Convinced I was imagining things because books and TV described paranormal encounters as something physical you saw. Not something you vividly imagined with perfect detail with your mind was there in the room you felt the emotions of. Years later while looking back at all paranormal events realize it wasn't imagined. I did denial of the paranormal a lot to cope as a kid. Part of me knew it was real though. I always believed in ghosts and would cry from ghost stories and hated horror movies. The icing on the cake is my great-grandfather was Native American from the Northeast. This was the Southwest California suburbs. But I'm blonde and the only sign of my ancestry is I tan very dark. Assholes were mad at a white kid that was actually one of them.
Be me. 17 years old. Visiting family in rural Canada. Uncle tells me about local legends. Says Wendigo sightings aren't uncommon in the area. Laugh it off as old folklore. Decide to go camping alone in the woods for the thrill. Pitch tent near a small clearing. Night falls, sitting by campfire. Hear distant howling, sounds like it's getting closer. Brush it off, probably just wolves. Fire starts dying down, get up to gather more wood. Feel like I'm being watched. Hear twigs snapping behind me. Turn around, nothing there. Get back to campfire, something feels off. Notice the woods are completely silent now. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Suddenly, a foul stench hits my nose. Smells like rotting meat. Hear a low growl, look up and see it. Tall, emaciated figure lurking at the edge of the clearing. Eyes glowing in the darkness. Its skin looks like it's stretched over bone, gaunt and sickly. Antlers protruding from its head. Realize it's a Wendigo. Heart starts racing, frozen in fear. It steps closer, its breath visible in the cold air. Snap out of it, grab my flashlight and shine it at the creature. It screeches and retreats into the woods. Pack up camp in record time, sprint back to my car. Drive back to Uncle's place, heart pounding. Tell him what happened. He nods knowingly. You saw it, didn't you? The Wendigo. Never go camping in those woods again. Still have nightmares about that night. Uncle tells me Wendigo only appear to those who are truly alone. Never going solo camping ever again. MFW, the legend was true all along.
Encounter with demons. Be me. B11. Move in with dad because so depressed at mom's house because she won't stop saying negative things about my dad. Shit was just as bad as my dad's house because of my stepmom. Mother went nuts and spent thousands of dollars on the best lawyer she could find. Dad and stepmom had to move out of my stepmom's nice large house into a rental home. I always liked her house the most. Never saw anything and always felt peace. Learned she had it blessed years ago. My sister told me a few years later that a friend's grandfather who was a cruel man died around the same time we met my stepmom and haunted my sister. He knew she could see him and would follow and harass her. He couldn't step inside the blessed home and glared at her from the outside. No idea what happened after my stepmom lost the house and sister said she started ignoring ghosts and they stopped harassing her. I move into the small rental home my dad and stepmom bought. First night there something comes. I see a creature crawl and loom over my chest. It's about 4 or 5 feet tall. Pitch black body stood out in the dark room. It had a friend clinging to the ceiling with a hunched back and legs and arms splayed like a gecko. It looked emaciated, had exoskeleton instead of skin. It looked charred with crumbling lumps like it had been burned. 4 spikes were in a circle on its head like horns. Giant shiny white or gray eyes. Claws instead of hands and 2 claw toes on its feet. Froze up from fear. Remembered dad had sleep paralysis. Do an experiment to test if that's this. Flex hand, can move fine. Take deep breath in and out, can breathe fine. It's real, I'm just too terrified to move. The things both make noises and shake from deep low chuckles at my fear. Do the only thing I can think of. Pray to God. Ask him to help me over and over. Go into a meditation state and pray until fall asleep. Repeats every night when they come back. Ashamed to admit it, but being a teen I masturbated in my room quite often during the daytime. I assumed they were gone because I didn't see them. Hide in room a lot because stepmom is emotionally abusive and will say anything to make me, a child, feel like shit. One night the demon on my bed chuckles and humps its hips. I assume it is mocking a human function it doesn't have since it doesn't even have genitals. Realize years later as an adult they were watching me in my room all the time even when I thought they weren't there. They were trying to tell me they watched me when I did private things in my room. So glad I was too scared and tired to realize what it meant back then. I have a massive fear of being watched or having my thoughts read. After 2 weeks pass, one night I'm in the middle of my praying when I suddenly hear something new and stop. A loud chime of a bell rang out loud as possible inside my head and echoed through my skull. 2 tiny angels with long white gowns, long brown hair, and white wings, about 4 inches tall fly through my wall on my left like it wasn't there. They both had swords they pull out and slash fast and vicious at the demons. For once I saw their big eyes grow wide with fear. The one above me raised its arm up in defense as it made an animal-like screech. The one on the ceiling fell to the floor and landed like a defensive cat on all fours, flinching at the sword strikes. The angels are hovering and swooping up and down left and right like tiny fast-moving master swordsmen. Both creatures flee and run on all fours, through my right wall away from the angels. The angels were hot on their heels in pursuit through the wall after them. Sent prayer to God a thank you, roll over, go to sleep. Never saw anything in that house again. The things I saw later after them were even worse. No happy ending when you move constantly to haunted goddamn houses. Because my mom wouldn't stop trying to tear my dad financially apart, we had to move after a year. My crazy mom wanted revenge and to get my dad to waste money through forced court cases.
The orb of black smoke. Be me. B14. For the only second time in my life, we moved into a nice apartment that wasn't haunted. It was tiny though, and my stepmom and dad had big egos, so of course the small quaint place wasn't good enough. So we moved out after a year or two. We moved into a rental home. It's a big gorgeous place with 2 floors and a beautiful large staircase. While the realtor was showing it to us, he showed us the upstairs hallway and pointed to a spot under the attic pull-down string in the ceiling. He casually mentioned an old Jewish man died in that home in that spot. My dad and stepmom don't care and nod like he told them small talk about the weather. While we lived there, everyone was tense and on edge from fear constantly. No one would talk about what made everyone so scared. 2 cats and the 2 dogs stared at a corner where the staircase downstairs met the wall. All 4 animals stared with intense focus at empty air. None of the 4 would even go upstairs. In my room at night, I eat in bed. I turned off my light and saw a giant ball shaped like a perfect circle in front of my door in the corner of the room. It took up the entire corner from floor to ceiling. Around its edges were fast flickering hazy, short, stumpy, wisps of smoke. The whole thing looked made up rippling smoke with a center too dense to see through. It was pitch black, darker than my dark room. Could feel an evil happiness coming from it, and I could tell it felt joy from my fear. I'm convinced it put me into a trance because I told myself it was my imagination and didn't run the hell away. It wasn't until we moved out after 2 years there that I snapped out of it and realized there was no way it was fake back then. The thing made me hear and see things to intensify my fear. I heard murmuring voices like a party of adults talking in another room where you can't pick out words. The noise came from the other side of my bedroom wall. If it wasn't for the fact the other side of my wall was the open staircase, I would have thought my parents had guests over for a party. The thing forced me to imagine monsters. But the monsters were like a cardboard cutout compared to it. I would consistently imagine an imp or goblin creature next to my bed. But it was a fixed image that didn't move. I would fight the thing by calming myself down. The more I calmed, the more it would force me to see scary monsters till I saw a crowd of monsters around my bed. But I knew they were fake even when they scared me. They didn't move. Like fake things frozen in place. The thing by contrast was constantly rippling its smoky short tentacles around its edges. It never wavered in my imagination like when I tried to make imaginary friends as a kid. It was solid and always there in the dark, even if I saw it through my mind's eye. It was harassing others in the home too, even if we didn't talk about it. My stepmom mentioned it once to belittle it and then looked terrified up our stairs. I could feel its happiness, it knew she feared it. My dad waved Sage frantically around to drive it away every 2 weeks. For 2 weeks it would be gone and I would have relief. But it would always come back. My father once outside the home told me his psychic friend told him it left and came back when the sage smudge wore off. It would just slip into the next door apartment and wait. My mental health deteriorated. Hilarious to me, my stepbrother who was fit and 18 would look at me so terrified if we stopped to talk in the hallway. Maybe it was the blank stare. Maybe it was the crazy laughter from my room because I would binge watch comedy shows to cope. Who knows? But I disturbed him and I thought it was hilarious, of course, because he was a douche. Get extremely depressed. Pet hermit crabs died from me being too depressed and my stepmom mocked me for it. She took every chance to make me feel like shit. She loved to mock me for things I didn't know how to do because I was neglected by my mom. Started to read constantly for escapism. Watched TV constantly in my room because my stepmom mocked me for anything she could think of when I stepped out to get water, food, or piss. Dad's idea of help was to shove me outside one day and say go do something. We were in a maze of suburbs with no park within walking distance. No sense of direction to speak of. Sat on the porch for hours waiting to be let back in. Started to draw disturbing pictures of monsters. Started reading JTHM and disturbing comic books with gore and monsters. I liked them because no one could hurt monsters. Stepmom got disturbed and said I needed to go to therapy. Yeah bitch, now that I look like my deteriorated mental health might affect you personally, like I'd snap and kill, then it was time to not neglect. The therapist was worse than useless. I have extreme social anxiety, effective neglect and emotional abuse, and didn't talk the first 3 sessions out of fear. My dad saw it as wasted money and stopped sessions right when my mental health started to just barely improve. I made the mistake of getting excited and telling him about practicing chess I wanted to play again with the therapist. My dad was angry and thought his money was spent on playing. You know, because his child he neglected the shit out of is supposed to sing like a canary about their feelings in therapy immediately. Both parents never asked me my opinion about anything in my entire life, so I never questioned the therapy getting taken from me. Eventually we move out to a big nice house because my dad almost died in a car accident and received a ton of money. Depression suddenly stopped being so severe. I snapped out of my trance the thing had me in and was terrified it kept me from believing it was real.
I will green text a story my grandpa told me. B. Ranger. B. 1965. B. Operating in Vietnam. Re Cambodia/Laos. Ordered to go to a specific spot and eliminate enemy forces there, come across a small camp of NVA. 4 men, he was very specific about that for some reason, waste them. Looking around, ammo caches, AKs, normal shit to find, look in the tent. Dead Russian that was killed in the short firefight. All kinds of weird tech in the tent. Experimental night vision and shit. Almost on K, a blacked out helicopter lands nearby. Paramilitary guys grab up all the strange high-tech equipment and the dead Russian. Tell them to burn everything, even the bodies. Fly away. I believe him, he is an honest man.
I knew an old man named Foster who lived in Colorado by himself with his dogs and cats. He smoked a pack a day. Growing up I had always heard that he fought in Vietnam, but he didn't talk about it much. During my senior year of college I took a class called Vietnam War Era History, which was taught by an ex-Army veteran who was under the auspices of Operation Phoenix. He asked us to either read a book about Vietnam or find a Vietnam vet and interview them. Long story short, I drove up to Colorado with my GF and my buddy. We went skiing and smoked weed. It finally came time for him to tell his story. I'll green text it because it will come out better that way. Foster joins in 62, volunteered for the draft. Goes to FT. Gordon, Georgia MP Academy. Joins up with the 560th MP Company. Gets stationed at the Hood. Volunteers to go to Vietnam because non-coms are asking for people who want to do something interesting and Foster says sure. Flies in a 4-engine turboprop from FT. Hood to Oklahoma, OK to Oakland, Cali, Oakland to Hawaii, Hawaii to Wake Island, Wake Island to Guam, Guam to Manila, Manila to Saigon Phu. Gets stationed at Ton Son Nhut Air Base. Jumping Joe Stillwell wanted helicopter gunners. They needed 16 guys from Foster's company. Foster, ever the volunteer, says I'll do it. Foster's training consists of riding in the back of a pickup truck and shooting at targets with an M2 on the runway at TSN Air Base. Base is pretty chill. Enlisted men and officers hang out with each other and are each other's friends because at this point in time Vietnam was the Wild West. There weren't any rows, there really wasn't any conception of civilians being differentiated from the insurgents, Viet Minh/Cong. Remember, this is before Kennedy got killed. Most Americans don't even know Vietnam exists, so US forces did what they wanted. Foster iterated that the VC didn't do much to US forces when he was there because the Vietnamese hadn't yet seen the US as a threat. Regardless, VC still threw grenades into the base, but Foster never had to haul ass to the bunker to avoid rocket fire. After training, which was cursory at best, Foster was a bona fide helicopter door gunner on the Sikorsky H-19s and H-34s. Foster's crew ferried people all over the place, even up to the DMZ, and more than likely into Laos and Cambodia. At this point in the story, when Foster started talking about missions, he began to get defensive about his service. I reassured him that I did not judge him negatively and that I appreciated his service. Foster killed a lot of people. Definitely killed women and children. He said if there was a guy with an SKS or AK spraying the side of your bird with fire, you lit up his whole block. The crew would do raids and close air support for guys on the ground, ARVN. Mostly Foster would rain hellfire down on the entire country of Vietnam with impunity. Foster's officer friends were Skyraider pilots. Some of the Skyraiders had tandem seating. Foster said the Skyraider pilots would fly up and down the Mekong and blow up sampans, little wooden boats, with their 650 calories. The boats didn't even need to shoot at them or have evidence of being supportive of insurgents. The pilots were just told to mess stuff up. Foster said the recoil from all 6 guns was enough to stall the Skyraider. Back to Door Gunner. Foster got shot at with everything. Arrows, rocks, and of course bullets and RPGs. One day Foster's tooth hurt. Goes into Saigon to see French dentist, no American dentists at this point in time. Huge throng of locals blocking the street stop Foster and his Jeep from continuing. In the middle of the street/intersection, Foster sees a Buddhist monk douse himself in gas and light himself on fire. Pretty much at this point Foster literally has a heart attack. He shuffles back to his trailer and pops some nitro pills to help his heart. After getting everything settled, he smokes a cigarette and comes back inside. Skyraider pilots had pet tigers on base. Foster continued doing helicopter runs until his tour ended. Goes back to the US to do stateside duty. Enlistment ends and Foster leaves the army. A few years after he left the military, some friendly gentlemen from Angola asked Foster to fight for them against commies in Africa. Foster declined and continued working as a fireman in Louisiana. Foster died a year later. I felt I should tell his story here so we can all try to imagine Foster's experiences and remember his service.
I have a story about a lump too. I don't know if it's something supernatural or relevant. It happened a couple of days ago. Be me. My father talks on the phone at 7 p.m. He tells me if I can catch him at work, because he has to work the night shift. I mean, he will be a night guard just for that night, because the guard is in the hospital, or he just stops going, I don't know. My father's workplace is just minutes from our house, but to get there you have to cross through areas where there are only trees. Go with my father. Think, don't worry Anon, you just have to walk for a few minutes alone in the middle of the darkness and in the middle of the trees. When I go up a small hill, I feel something fall on my left foot. It was something that rolled easily under the leaves, maybe it was the size of half a soccer ball. It could have been anything, but I was in the middle of darkness and in an area where there are rumors about paranormal activity. Just ignore it Anon, and keep running. Finally arrive with my father. That may have been just a small log that fell on my foot, but I was in the middle of the darkness, so I was a little afraid.
And now the stupidest paranormal encounter. I wish it wasn't real because it's so goddamn stupid. My friend still teases me about it. Be at the creepy apartment with the black orb before we moved out. Got super into the paranormal and learned about fairies and plant spirits. Had zero friends and loved nature, so I fell in love with the idea of making friends with some fairies. Found a man's guide from coast to coast. The man claimed his grandmother told him fairies were plant spirits. They ignored us unless we tried to notice them. They could be kind, and the man claimed he befriended one. He said he gifted them whiskey and milk on his back porch and they would drink the offering essence. Started to try to use the part of your eyes that is like static when you look in a dark room. You're supposed to see invisible figures walking around ignoring us if you focus hard and practice. One night after I managed to fall asleep, I half woke up. I always slept with my window open with a screen on it to feel the breeze. I was laying on my side curled up, facing the window, away from the orb. Felt a warm lump against my belly. Half asleep, think it must one of the cats. Snap wide awake and for the first time realize the cats never came into my room. Suddenly a flash of movement as the thing that is about 9 inches tall darts in a flash out my window. It passed through the screen like it wasn't there. What I saw wasn't scary in the slightest and just baffled me. It was a goddamn gnome. Blue shirt, brown pants, white beard, and an incredibly tall and pointy red hat. It leapt out at an angle so I only saw the back of it. But it was a freaking gnome. I closed my window and vowed to never sleep with it open or try to talk to plant spirits again. Asked a paranormal expert friend years later what it was doing. I thought it was feeding on me since I did not give an offering of alcoholic milk. I was also already getting my fear fed on by the orb, so I didn't know if it was also trying to eat my energy. If it was sneaking around because it was in the orb's dangerous territory. My friend thought it wanted to help and comfort me. But I refused to trust anything means me well without proof. Also, yes, I know if it could move through a screen, then the window glass was nothing. It was empty gesture by a scared child. It didn't come back, so maybe the open window was an invitation needed enter.
This is the series of events surrounding what I experienced regarding my nephew's death. I am not great at green texting, so. This was early 2000s, I was bouncing between my mom's house and my grandmother's. I was about 12 during the time. Technically I should be at my grandmother's since she has custody of me, but my mom is working on gaining custody of me again, so we're bending some rules. During this my mom is given custody of my nephew and niece after my sister abandoned them. Let's call them Edward and Bonnie. During the summer my stepdad is released from prison and him and my mom start cooking meth again. Edward is showing behavioral problems, he's a toddler and suffering from the abuse my sister and his dad put him through. Stepdad claims he can fix my nephew, but it's just code for horrific abuse. November, my grandmother has a fall and needs someone to take care of her. They thought I would be the best person, because yeah, that makes sense. Anyways, I am moving back to my grandmother's about 10 hours away from my mom's house. Before I leave, my nephew, in the way a 4-year-old speaks, says, "You won't see me again, I love you." Tell my grandmother about this and she explains toddlers and babies have object permanence, so I thought it was just that. December that same year the phone rings in our kitchen and I answer it. It was my grandmother and our neighbor and they were mid-conversation when I answered the phone. "I can't believe he's dead, she killed him." I hear my grandmother sobbing. Suddenly, my grandmother comes from the living room and asks who was on the line. I look at her and it's obvious she hasn't been crying. Confused, I tell her it was her and our neighbor and asked who died. Don't be stupid. I wasn't on the phone, and no one died. Turns out, she was outside on the front porch having drinks with said neighbor. Later that night I had vivid dreams of news reporters talking about a couple killing their grandson. We'll post a part 2. Next morning, I am in the living room playing Law's Wind Waker and I suddenly hear my grandmother screaming from the kitchen. "He's dead. Edward is dead. She killed him." I run into the kitchen to find out my stepdad and mom killed my nephew. Later that afternoon I hear my grandmother talking on the phone and I pick up the phone trying to eavesdrop on her conversation. It was the same exact conversation that I heard her and our neighbor have on the phone the day before. On my grandmother's deathbed 3 years later she held my hand and said, "I blame you for Edward's death." Fast forward to 2016 and I am wandering around a flea market. There's some palm reader there giving free readings. I don't believe in the shit, so I keep walking. I end up walking past the palm reader again hours later and this time she's beckoning me over. Me being a shitty edgy young adult, I decide to humor her. I go over and sit down and she grabs my hand. "Edward wants you to stop being sad about him dying. It wasn't your fault, you were a child. He loves you and wants you to be happy. Edward is here with us now, he's been following you around." Welp, I believe in the paranormal now. In 2020 I started to go to therapy to heal from my trauma and all that. And now whenever I dream about confronting my abusers, or something healing related. My nephew is there, smiling and encouraging me.
Now that my street cred among this dumpster fire called /x/ is in the shitter, here's the most terrifying encounter. Be me. Be 19. Be in boring suburbs home without a single evil entity. Like the loving assholes my dad and stepmom are, they say I'm a lazy and good for nothing while simultaneously working 12-hour shifts for my dad's business and trying to be his apprentice. They threatened to kick me out. Mother, who moved to Ohio, and I have improved our relationship by now. Take up her offer to move to Ohio. Get a job, get freedom from income, life is good. Except the house I moved to in Ohio had 3 entities and was haunted as shit. Around the first week I moved in, a neighbor woman and I started to talk. She said an old man haunted the house. She said he was a sweetheart and she asked him to turn off a light, and he did for her when she went there to check on the place for the old owners. Said a little girl saw an old man ghost with a bandage on his neck in there. It's the most terrifying house I've been in, and the sweet old man was scared, I think. I only saw the ghost of a very old man in my closest. I think he possessed me a few times because once my voice became gruff and I became angry in my room when I lost something and didn't talk like myself. My brother in the hallway was watching and stared at me like he didn't know me and was scared. Luckily it wore off. At nighttime I would get up to pee once a night. The upstairs hallway made A+ shape. Learned from paranormal expert friend at the time that was really bad, and crossroads acted as doorway for things to come here. Haven't found any info like that with personal research, but I believe it. When I woke up I would imagine in vivid detail something I could see through the wall. A dark black creature crouched halfway up the stairs. All doors upstairs were kept shut at night. My room was across from my brother's and the toilet was across from the stairs. As soon as I opened my door it moved. It was human-shaped. Its limbs were too long and too thin. Pitch black with a smooth face without a mouth or eyes. It moved its limbs in jerky movements. It moved when I moved down the hallway as it moved up the stairs on a all-fours bear crawl. Its arms were so long it held its elbows up in the air when it bent its arms. I got to the bathroom quickly like a race and closed the door. It froze. I could feel its eyes on me when I was forced to look its way as I closed the bathroom door. I never looked at it, but I could sense its presence like a stain on my perception even if my eyes were closed or the wall was between us. Peed. Took a deep breath with a hand on the door on. I couldn't stay in the bathroom. Ran to my room as fast as I could. As I turned to close the door, I saw it. Its head passed the staircase entrance. It turned its head and it was staring right at me. Turning my way to come up as the door shut. Then it froze. Like a good sport who lost a game. A game with rules only it knew. This happened every single night. Since I was convinced I just had an active imagination to cope, I told myself it was fake and my reaction to my fear of the dark. Then I realized I never once heard my brother get up at night to pee, get water, anything. He kept his door shut tight. As a kid he was always up at night in strange hours to the point I screamed at him at 4 a.m. for waking me up with Donkey Kong intro music on the N64 when we were really little. That was the only house he didn't move a muscle to leave that room after dark. Part of me wonders if he sensed it and had more sense and wants to ask. Another part is scared of confronting the idea the thing that was on the stairs was real. The shadow man. Be in the house with the old man ghost and the thing on the stairs. One day my mom decided for me that I would like the room in the basement better. It's a walled-off corner of the basement with a door right next to the basement steps. The basement steps line up with the upstairs and downstairs steps. I didn't tell her anything about the staircase entity, so I have no idea why she got the idea in her head. Get put in a room that's already decorated with a random chair in the corner. My mother thought I would be happy after a lifetime of making no choices, if she chose every part of the room for me. No longer see the thing on the stairs because I don't leave my room at night. I felt more uneasy being closer to the stairs right outside my door, and had no idea what being directly under them would do if I ventured onto the stairs at night. When intuition screams, I listen. In my room is a new thing only in there. A black silhouette of a man in a wide brim hat. It's there day or night and it doesn't feel as evil as the staircase creature. It is content to sit in the corner chair and smugly pretend it is its chair put there for it. It had the aura of a leader full of themselves, and a part of me wondered if it was the leader of the staircase creature. Luckily I didn't have to investigate or discover jack shit because my mom's marriage crumbled. Moved into a nice boring apartment with a crazy bitch roommate while my mom and brother moved to Georgia.
I've had a few spooky supernatural experiences due to the girl I was married to at the time. Be married to cute castiza Mexican. Little titties, fat ass and mad daddy issues. Didn't know it at the time but also a pathological liar. They story. Get fever in summer of 2021. Living in one bedroom apartment with, now ex-wife. Been sleeping off illness for going on 12 hours. Having crazy fever dreams. Wife decides it's a good time to try and do supernatural shit. Fever of 103, sweating through bedsheets. Hear banging on apartment walls. Think it's fever dream bullshit. Wife comes flying into bedroom and hides under sheets. That's weird. Pounding intensifying. Ask wife what the hell is going on, keep in mind I'm delirious, sick, and now pissed off cause the bitch woke me up. I messed up anon. Pounding getting louder, starting to come to my senses. Realize my 1911 is in the living room, don't really know what is going on but don't want to deal with it without firepower. Get up to go into living room. Don't go in there says the wife. Okay, now really freaking out. Whole apartment still pounding, best way I can describe it is like someone beating on the walls. But all of them, at the same time. Might have been a migraine but I could feel the pounding in my chest, like bass at a concert. Storm out into living room, see something dark in the corner of the room. Make a beeline for gun. Now adequately armed, survey the living room. Pentagram in middle of floor with candles around it. Brain registers the dark thing in corner. 7 foot tall void. Looks like no face from Spirited Away without the mask. We make eye contact, no eyes but can tell it's looking at me, sizing me up. Pounding has stopped at this point. Decide I'm delirious and this is more fever dream bullshit and decide to go back to bed with my 1911. Walk past the thing glaring at it, it feels. Indifference towards me. Boredom? Go back to bed, that's the end of the encounter. A day later my fever broke and I grilled my girl on what the hell happened. She told me that she was bored and wanted to summon something. She messed up the ritual and the something got loose. For the next couple years I would have nightmares about the something. Invoking the name of Jesus Christ seems to piss it off and make it go away, and it hasn't popped up in a while. I divorced the girl for being a pathological liar among other things. If anyone has any idea on what she was doing I'm all ears. I was dabbling into the paranormal before this happened, and this event actually turned me back towards the Lord as invoking his name seems to be the only thing that works for warding off negative entities. Thinking back I'm not actually sure if it was a pentagram on the floor, but there was something ritualist on the floor that she was using. Again the memory is fuzzy.
Here's one I like. I saw some strange stuff in a tunnel in Vietnam. I've kept my mouth shut for almost 50 years, why the hell would I start talking now? Well friends, terminal cancer will do that to you. Shit you thought you'd take to the grave suddenly becomes shit you desperately want to tell someone, anyone. I won't bore you with a long lament about my time in Vietnam. It was shitty for everyone involved. It was particularly shitty for me as I was 5 feet 3 inches. If you don't know what being particularly short during the Vietnam War entailed, let me fill you in. You arrive in country and a senior officer points at you and says you'd be a good fit for the tunnel commandos, wanna join? Now technically it's a question, as service in those platoons was voluntary, but it sure as shit didn't feel like a question. It felt like an order. And so that was my burden for the war, to be a tunnel rat, climbing down into deep, dank, Dangerous tunnels filled with people and animals who wanted to kill me. Usually we operated in the huge Chu Chi tunnel complex near Saigon, but not on that day. On that day we were ordered to investigate a tunnel complex way up north, west of Da Nang. 2 of us were sent into the tunnel that day, myself and Benoit. Now usually black guys manage to avoid becoming tunnel rats on account of them being so tall, but Benoit was burdened with the double misfortune of being short and black during the Vietnam War, a curse I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I was first into the hole and Benoit followed. We both had our Model 39s, some C4, our wits and not much else. If you're wondering why we carried the small caliber Model 39s, go fire a Colt .45 in a narrow tunnel and come back to me. The last guy who tried that got a ticket home with blood pouring out of his ears. We crawled for what felt like an age. The tunnel was a tight fit, which meant it was probably freshly dug. It also stank something foul, that usually meant either spoiled food or some poor VC bastard died down there and was left to rot. After about 40 minutes of crawling in total silence, I saw the tunnel ahead open into a room. I tapped Benoit on the head with my foot. I heard him ready his pistol. I climbed down into the open chamber pointing my pistol at the shadows. The room was dimly lit by a small oil lamp. It was also deserted. We took a moment to adjust. It was the longest single tunnel segment either of us had ever crawled through. It also had no traps, which was unusual. Where was everyone who dug the damn thing? Save for the lamp hanging from the roof and a canvas tarp on the opposite wall, the room was empty. I approached the tarp and used my pistol to move it aside. Behind the tarp was a stone staircase leading down. A stone staircase? This far underground? I whispered to Benoit, VC didn't build this. This is old, very old, older than America old. Benoit whispered back with fear in his voice. We've come this far, we have to keep going, I replied. We both walked slowly down the narrow staircase. Our flashlights had red lenses and I swear the illuminated staircase looked like we were descending into hell. The staircase was almost as deep as the tunnel was long. Finally I saw the staircase blocked by another tarp. Light was coming from the other side. I moved aside the tarp with my pistol. My finger trembled on the trigger. My eyes lit up, my heart raced. I almost pulled the trigger, but I didn't. Something made me pause. The room had at least 10 people in it, none of them armed. I pointed my pistol at the group and illuminated them with my flashlight. They didn't respond. They just stood there rocking gently forward and back. Benoit, don't shoot, there's people in here, but there's something wrong with them. I stepped into the tiny room which was lit only by small candles. Benoit followed. We both shone our flashlights at the people. They paid no attention. They continued to rock gently forward and back. I shone my flashlight in one of their faces. I clicked my fingers. She didn't respond. Her clothes told me she was VC. They were all VC. 3 women and 7 men, all gently rocking forward and back, not a care in the world. Their eyes were a solid color, which color I can't really say as I could only illuminated them with my red flashlight. Benoit motioned with his flashlight to the corner. Their rifles all sat in a pile. Badly rusted. Jesus Christ, Benoit, how long have these poor bastards been down here? I don't think Jesus Christ frequents this establishment, came Benoit's terrified response in his thick Cajun accent. I shone my light to the front of the room. The VC were all facing a small altar. I walked toward it. On the simple stone plinth stood a gold statue illuminated by several candles. The statue was ornately crafted. It was of a beautiful naked woman, the top half anyway. The bottom half was something like an octopus. Dozens of tiny gold tentacles had been meticulously crafted to woman's torso instead of legs. The statue had some writing at its base, a writing I didn't recognize. I reached out to pick the statue up and take a better look, but Benoit shouted, "Stop, don't touch it." I retracted my hand about an inch from the statue. "We need to leave this place," quickly Benoit said as he put his hand on my shoulder. "Are we just gonna leave them like this?" I said as I shone my light in their eyes. "We'll plant the C4 charges and put them on a 90-minute timer," he said. He was already removing the C4 from a pouch on his belt. "They're unarmed," I implored, turning to Benoit. "These people are dead, maybe worse than dead. I saw something like this once before, at home in the bayou." I didn't argue any longer. We planted the C4 charges in a rush, set the timers for 90 minutes and ran up the stone staircase as fast as we could. It felt like a lifetime till we reached the small room with the lamp. I climbed into the tunnel and Benoit followed. Suddenly we could hear a woman's voice faintly calling from far behind us, "Ignore it, keep moving." Benoit shouted from behind me. I didn't need to be told. I wasn't going back. It was the longest crawl of my life. I saw daylight and kept crawling even though my hands were raw and bloodied. I emerged into the light of day and gasped for fresh air. Benoit followed. We warned the others about the C4 charges but told them nothing else. Benoit and I sat in total silence away from the tunnel entrance. Waiting. Praying. The ground shook, a dull thud was heard and a spray of dirt emerged from the tunnel. We both breathed a sigh of relief. It is only after an experience like that you ask yourself the small questions. To this day I still ask myself, who the hell was keeping the candles lit in that damn room? I told you already I wouldn't bore you with most of the details of my time in Vietnam. I also won't ever refer to it as Nam, as I found after returning home, it's the rear echelon assholes who spent the war pencil pushing who most like to put on a husky voice and say Nam, in some deep and mournful way. The short story is, after the incident in the tunnels west of Da Nang, Benoit and I were a little messed up, so we were useless for tunnel work. Both of us were transferred into 2 separate regular platoons in the mechanized infantry. About a month after that, I was on a search and destroy mission when a rookie stepped over a VC tripwire. The tripwire was connected to one of our own captured claymores. The claymore blew the rookie's legs off and lodged a bunch of metal and bone fragments in the side of my torso. I survived, and for my trouble I got a ticket home. Well, I say home, but I got a ticket to a military hospital called Camp Zama in Japan. They managed to pull most of the bits of shrapnel out of my torso over 2 operations. The hospital was dangerously overcrowded. At night the screaming of the other patients was horrendous and the stench reminded me of that goddamn tunnel. I was actually happy when, due to overcrowding, I was transferred to a much older building in the complex. It was some type of disused asylum ward, a total wreck. It only had maybe 15 patients, mostly guys with minor injuries. But I didn't care, it was far enough away from the main buildings that I didn't have to hear the poor bastards screaming for their mothers every night. I was on the mend, which was a blessing and a curse. My tour wasn't up and if I was declared fit to serve I might be sent back to Vietnam, and I wasn't going back, not after what I saw in that tunnel. 2 American military doctors and a female Japanese nurse arrived to assess my situation late one evening. "Your injuries seem to be healing quite well," said one stern-faced doctor. "Physically at least," said the second doctor who wore narrow glasses. The first doctor gave him a look that could cut glass. The doctor wearing the glasses was clearly the psychiatrist. He would have to be my ticket home, if I could convince him I had lost my mind, but I couldn't overplay my hand. The nurse just stood behind them diligently taking notes. "How is your emotional state? Have you had any troubling thoughts? I understand you were a tunnel commando," probed the psychiatrist. "Yes, I sometimes have nightmares about the things I saw in the tunnels. I sometimes think about harming myself." I put a quiver into my voice to add to the effect, but neither of them were buying it. I've never been a good liar. How messed up a situation was this, that after the shit I saw I needed to fake being mentally unstable just to get a ticket home? I was despondent and I dropped the act. Much as I wanted to go home, I couldn't tell them about what happened in the tunnels. I wanted to go home but not to be thrown in a mental asylum. "What kind of things did you see in the tunnels?" the psychiatrist asked calmly. "Doc, near Da Nang I went down into the deepest, darkest tunnel you can imagine, and if I told you what I saw in that tunnel you wouldn't believe me anyway, so just write whatever you need to on your clipboards and leave me be." The stern-faced doctor was unimpressed with my tone, but as I was speaking the Japanese nurse stopped taking notes. Her face went deathly pale and she stared at me with a look of terror on her face. "Well, we'll check on you again tomorrow. Try to get some rest," said the psychiatrist who had a curious look on his face, and with that they all shuffled off. The nurse stared back at me as they went, her face still pale with fear. I went to sleep that night knowing that soon they would send me back to Vietnam. I awoke late that night to the whispering voice of a woman. I couldn't hear where it was coming from. I got out of bed and walked uneasily, rolling my drip along with me. The woman's voice was coming from the next corridor. It must be that nurse, I thought, but the voice sounded all too familiar. I wasn't going walking the halls without a weapon. I searched the unmanned nurse's station. I found a scalpel in one of the drawers, it would have to do. I shuffled through the large wooden doors leading to the next corridor. The light bulbs flickered in the dimly lit corridor, the paint was peeling off the walls. Far to the end of the corridor I could see the shape of a woman standing near a window looking out into the night. I shuffled toward her with the scalpel leading the way, rolling my drip with my left hand. As I approached, the faint whispers became louder and I could finally make out the words, "Defiler, come to the red house," it whispered. My drip caught in a cracked tile on the floor, making an awful clanking sound. The woman turned and moved quickly toward me. My heart raced in terror. I prepared the scalpel. "You shouldn't be out of bed," it was the nurse, a lit cigarette in her hand. She must have been smoking by the window. Her English was near perfect. She must have been the daughter of an American GI. Many of them married Japanese women after the Second World War ended. "Why were you whispering to me?" I asked, still pointing the scalpel. "I wasn't whispering," she said, confused and frightened. "You were whispering. You called me Defiler? What does that mean?" I demanded, my hand clutching the scalpel. Once again her face took on the same pale, terrified look. The cigarette dropped from her hand. "You're not safe here in Japan. Or back in Vietnam, they'll be looking for you." Her voice trembled as she spoke. Who'll be looking for me?" I implored her. "I don't know what they call themselves, every place has a different name for them. The silent plague is the translation of what we call them here in Japan. All I know for certain is, they will be looking for you. Maybe you will be safe if you get back to America." Her words offered little comfort. "You have to help me. You have to convince the doctors that I'm crazy," I said to her, almost begging. "I will try. Give me the scalpel," she said calmly. I handed her the scalpel, and as quick as I had handed it to her, she slashed it across my arm. I roared out in pain. She dropped the scalpel and grabbed my hand, putting pressure on the wound. "This is the only way," she said. I instantly realized her plan. 2 orderlies came rushing into the old corridor from an adjoining corridor, alerted by my screams. "Get me some bandages. He's trying to kill himself," she roared at the men. One of the orderlies ran for bandages. The other ran over to support me. I slunk down into the orderly's arms. More from pageantry than blood loss. The wound wasn't that deep. I had suffered much worse before. She had done a good job. I was put back in bed and stitched up. The next night I was visited by the psychiatrist. He was alone. He looked at me coldly, noted something on my chart and asked, "Have you been hearing voices or whispers?" "No," I replied quickly. "It's funny, we had a young soldier from Louisiana in here about 3 weeks before you arrived. He was also a tunnel commando. He claimed he was hearing whispers, but he could never tell me what they said. We had to send the poor fellow home." The psychiatrist maintained his usual cold, clinical composure, but his eyes seemed to burn with a fanatic rage. "If you did hear whispers, and they told you something, a secret maybe, you would tell me, wouldn't you?" "I'm not hearing any voices or whispers," I responded with as much resolve as I could muster. The rage slowly faded from his eyes. "You are being transferred to a hospital in the US, you'll be assigned a psychiatrist there," he said before pausing. "I hope when you get home, you will find whatever it is in life you are searching for," and with it he smiled and walked away. He knew I was lying to him. That very night I was driven to the airport and pushed in a wheelchair into a C-130 by an MP. The flight was filled with men who were broken physically or mentally, and most probably a few guys like me, just desperate not to go back to Vietnam. But unlike them, I was actually hearing voices, but I wasn't crazy. The flight took off. I breathed a sigh of relief. I removed my dog tags, praying I would never need them again. I opened the zipper on my bag to put the dog tags inside, and there staring back at me was a small crudely made clay replica of the golden statue I had seen in the tunnels. "So what happened when you got home?" I hear you ask. Well, for a while very little. I was kept in the hospital for about 3 weeks. The new psychiatrist seemed swamped with work and saw I wasn't really a danger to myself or others, and so I was discharged. I tried finding Benoit as soon as I could, but he had gone off the grid, as they might say these days. But in truth, disappearing back then was as simple as not listing your name in the damn phone book. Despite living in the guy's pocket for 8 months of my life, I knew very little about him. I knew he was from a couple of hours west of New Orleans and he had a sister named Marie. Not exactly solid facts to track a man down by. Soon I gave up trying, I just decided to try and forget about everything. Vietnam, the tunnel, the woman's voice. But the damn statue was always there as a constant reminder. I kept it wrapped in cloth, afraid to touch the damn thing. Eventually I did what every other person in New York did with something they wanted to get rid of. I threw it in the East River. It would find good company down there with all the discarded mob weapons and photos of ex-girlfriends. I had a small amount of money coming in from my veteran disability payments. I topped this up by working odd jobs, when I could find the work, that is. New York in 1969 wasn't exactly a fun place to be. The city stank from uncollected garbage and there seemed to be a strike or a riot every other day. The teachers, the sanitation workers, hell, it got so bad even the gays started rioting, and they always seemed a peaceful bunch to me. I lived down near Greenwich Village, so I was right in the middle of the mess. Crime was also a huge problem and I rarely left the apartment without my pistol, and that's how it went for about 6 months. I worked a little and tried to avoid getting shot or stabbed. Then one night out of the blue the phone rang. I generally only got calls from cold call companies. It was a relatively new thing back then and every asshole outfit with a phone was trying to sell their crap. I picked up the phone. I don't want to buy radiators, life assurance or mortgage protection. So go F yourself, I calmly said. There was a tiny pause. It's Philippe. Philippe Benoit, I see you haven't lost your way with words, came the response. Benoit, Jesus, I tried tracking you down when I got back from Vietnam. I couldn't find a trace of you. Where the hell have you been? New Orleans. Look, I don't want to say too much over the phone, but I received a very strange package in the mail. Turns out someone was able to track me down. My heart sank with the news. I didn't need to ask what was in the package, I could guess. Can you come down to New Orleans? I could offer you work and a place to crash if you need it. Do you have anything pressing keeping you in New York? I looked out the window as I listened to Benoit on the phone. 2 NYPD officers were beating the ever-loving shit out of some guy with batons. A small group nearby were raining bottles at them. Yeah, I could do with getting out of New York for a while. I could be there in a few days, I replied. Benoit filled me in on the details of where to meet. He didn't want to talk on the phone as if he thought someone might be listening. The next morning I threw what little possessions I had into my old beaten-up Impala and hit the road. I didn't bother giving notice to the landlord of my fleabag apartment. You might think me mad for taking the trip to New Orleans. I suppose I could have just hung up the phone and forgot about Benoit and the things we saw, but that's just not me. He needed my help. We had been through hell together in Vietnam, and I don't mean that figuratively. I mean I felt we had literally descended into some kind of hell in that tunnel. I wasn't about to leave the guy to deal with this shit alone. It felt good to get out of New York. The journey was long and the summer was sweltering. I drove relentlessly, wanting to get to New Orleans as quickly as possible. I avoided the big cities and only stopped to sleep. On the last night of the journey I stopped at a cheap motel near a one-horse town about an hour past Birmingham. The reception building was small. The desk was manned by a middle-aged man. I guessed he was the owner on account of there being a photo of him in uniform as a younger man on the wall. It looked like it was taken somewhere in Europe during the Second World War. You look a little worse for wear. Long journey? Where are you headed to? The owner made small talk as he handed me my key. Houston, I lied as I fumbled with my things. I'm not fully sure why I lied. It's not like whoever these people with the statues were, they could manage to staff every shithole hotel between New York and New Orleans with staff, on the off chance I passed through. I was so exhausted that night I fell asleep fully clothed as soon as my head hit the pillow. I awoke in a sweat to the whispers of a woman. It was still night out. I took my pistol from my bag and tucked it into the back of my jeans. I left the room and followed the voice, the same phrase over and over. Defiler, come to the Red House. I walked down the steps to ground level. The voice became louder as I approached a soda machine at the corner of the motel. A light on top glowed red in the night. Defiler, almost like it was inside my head. I'm not a defiler, I mumbled back to no one. What was that, honey? You want to defile me? Well, that's gonna cost you. Usually my customers don't put it in that kind of eloquent language, she laughed. It was a whore, a well-dressed one at that, a little too well-dressed and refined for this motel. She was leaning near the illuminated soda machine. Sorry, I was just talking to myself, I replied. The whispers had stopped. You looking for a date? She casually inquired. No, I'm fine thanks, just came to get a soda, I quickly responded. You sure? It's a long way to New Orleans, I could help you relax, she said, licking her lips. My mind froze with fear, but I kept my composure. I'm headed to Houston, I calmly responded. Funny, the owner said you were on your way to New Orleans, she dryly retorted. Well, the owner's mistaken, I replied, matching her tone. That's what I told him when he said you were headed to Houston. It took some of my charm to persuade him, but he finally told me you had a map that showed a route to New Orleans when you checked in. I said nothing in response. Sadly, what he couldn't tell me was where you were headed once you got to New Orleans. Yeah, well, maybe your charm isn't as persuasive as you think, I responded, all the while I was considering taking out my pistol and putting it to her head. She tilted her head forward a little, her face glowed a fiery red under the light of the soda machine. She bared her teeth and her eyes took on the same look of fanatic rage I had seen in the psychiatrist's eyes at the hospital. Oh, you have no idea how persuasive I can be, she spat with unrestrained rage. I reached for my pistol, but she slipped around the corner and ran into the black of night. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, she said, laughing from somewhere deep in the darkness. Running out after her into the night would be a fool's errand. I ran in a panic to the motel reception building. Maybe she had divulged some tiny piece of information to the owner. I could be persuasive too. Broken ribs usually jogged people's memory. Maybe he wouldn't have any information, but either way I was going to sternly educate him on the perils of spilling your guts to strange women who offer free blowy joeys. The small reception building was dimly lit. There was no one behind the desk. I rang the bell but got no response. Impatiently I walked behind the counter. I opened the back office door. As I opened the door, the metallic smell of fresh blood hit my nostrils. I covered my nose. The owner lay dead on his back. His mouth was duct taped shut. 2 glass shards had been rammed into his eye sockets. Tough bastard, I didn't give him enough credit. He wasn't falling for her hooker routine, so she had to torture him for what little information he had, or maybe it was just to send me a message. I wasn't hanging around for the cops, maybe this was a setup. Either way, I wasn't sticking around. I wiped down the office doorknob with my sleeve. My fingerprints being anywhere else in the building could be explained, but not on the back office door. I walked to my room with as much outward calm as I could muster. I packed my things and got in my car. I drove out into the night. With luck, I'd make it to New Orleans by morning. I knew one thing for certain. These people, whoever they were, wanted that voice to keep whispering to me. They wanted to know where it was leading me. That was the only reason I was still alive. As soon as they figured that it might be less trouble to torture me rather than just follow me, I'd end up like the owner of the motel. The pistol was digging into my back, so I took it from my jeans and opened the glove compartment to put it inside. As the glove compartment opened, a small clay statuette fell out. I didn't need to look at it, I already knew what it was. I put the pistol away and kept driving. Safety in numbers, I thought, as I sped toward New Orleans. Benoit would have a plan, he always did. I barreled my way through the night, praying the engine of my old Impala wouldn't give up the ghost from the hard ride. Day was breaking as I crossed Lake Pontchartrain. It glowed yellow with the rising sun, but in truth it was a cesspool brown the closer I got to the city. Benoit had just told me to get to the French Quarter and call a phone number when I got there. The French Quarter wasn't quite the tourist mecca it is today, but it was still popular, especially with service members on shore leave looking for cheap thrills. It was seedy as hell. But a city like that can be a blessing in disguise for men in my situation. Seedy cities are easy to disappear in if needed, and there's usually some unscrupulous ex-service member willing to sell you some extra firepower. And who was I to judge an unscrupulous man? I had just fled a murder scene. I parked the car near a payphone and got out. I fumbled with some change and dialed the number Benoit had given me. The phone rang for what felt like a lifetime. Then someone picked up. "It's me, I'm here," I said, not giving any other details. "Good to hear your voice. I thought something might have happened to you on the road," came Benoit's relieved response. "Yeah, well, something did happen to me on the road. I'll fill you in when I see you," I replied while looking around the street through the dirty glass. Benoit gave me an address a couple of blocks away. He didn't say anything else over the phone. I drove the car over to the address. It was on a quiet side street. When I arrived at the address, I thought I must have been mistaken. It was a small weird store, not an apartment building. Marie's General Goods and Supplies. Strangest general goods store I had ever seen. Black drapes covered the windows, and there wasn't much sign of life. I pushed the door with apprehension. A small bell rang and I was hit by the smell of burning herbs. I walked into the store. It was filled with antiques and what I would refer to as voodoo shit, although I never quite grasped the difference between hoodoo, voodoo and all those other African religions. "You made it." Benoit emerged from behind the counter with a look of relief on his face. He walked over and hugged me, beating his hand on my back so firmly it knocked the air out of my lungs a little. "Take it easy, you'll break a rib," I said, laughing a little. "Sorry, just good to see you," he replied, releasing me. "You hadn't called in a few days, I thought you might not make it." "I almost didn't, something happened to me while I was on the road," I replied. I wanted to fill Benoit in on all the details of my trip, but I was more perplexed by the shop we were standing in. "Marie's? Who owns this place, your sister?" I inquired, puzzled. "It was my grandmother's, my sister is named after her, she died just after we were shipped out to Vietnam. My sister looked after the place while I was away, almost as soon as I was home she moved to L.A. She has a notion to become a singer. My grandmother left her some money and I got the creepy shop," Benoit said while sweeping his arm across the selection of weird merchandise in the shop. "And people buy this stuff?" I said, pointing at an odd selection of herbs. "Business is good. The shop is kinda discreet so the tourists think they've found some genuine secret voodoo shop. Don't worry, 95% of this stuff is completely harmless," Benoit said, smiling. "And the other 5%, I skeptically inquired. "Yeah, that stuff's not for tourists. I keep those items in the back storeroom. Along with an item I got in the mail. Speaking of which, what happened to you on the road?" Benoit walked over to the door and locked it. I filled Benoit in on the hospital in Japan, the statuette and the woman at the motel. The only details I left out was the murder of the motel owner and the whispers. I didn't want to freak him out or involve him in a murder I might get accused of. Benoit listened, looking concerned. "I got the same statuette in the mail. It was sent to my old address, so I don't know how long it had been there, probably since I got back from Vietnam. There's no way to know for sure, it had no postmark. Once I got it I called you straight away. I got worried about the statuette, so I checked all the books here in the shop to see if any of them had any details on the statue or the woman in it, but I turned up nothing," Benoit continued. I was stumped, so I called the university at Baton Rouge. They pointed me in the direction of a retired professor, some expert in ancient religions. So I paid him a visit. He lives about an hour from here in the middle of nowhere. Nice house, but the land is practically a swamp. "Did he recognize the statue?" I asked on tenterhooks. "Kinda. He said that it wasn't really African or American. The statuette is a crude modern replica, but the woman depicted was probably the Silent Mother, some ancient god people worshipped in coastal communities the world over. But her religion probably died away at least a millennia ago. Apparently she can grant her followers eternal bliss, if they worship at her temple. Trouble is, no one knows where her temple is. According to the professor, it probably doesn't exist. He told me to give him a couple of days to do more research. Those people in the tunnel sure didn't look like they found eternal bliss. Then again, it didn't look like a temple either, just a small shrine," I mused. "And did he get back to you?" "And that was a couple of days ago. I rang him all morning but he's not answering the phone," Benoit responded. "Aw shit, we gotta drive over there now. And bring a weapon," I said, putting on my jacket. "Should we just give him another day?" Benoit said, perplexed. "He may not have another day, Benoit," I said as we walked out the door. Benoit locked it behind him, setting the sign to closed. We drove out of the city to the west in Benoit's car. It was sweltering. "In the tunnel in Vietnam, I thought you said you had seen something like that before?" I probed Benoit. "Well, I was embellishing a little. Look. When I was 14, a local counselor was accused of some pretty serious stuff. Several local women made some serious allegations about the guy, but he was white and powerful and so was able to buy his way out of trouble. But the locals weren't satisfied with that outcome. One night my grandmother drove me out to the middle of nowhere, to a sort of ceremony. My memory of the event is kinda hazy. There were lots of people chanting, and there was this voodoo priest. They forced the counselor to drink this weird liquid. The counselor's eyes took on a kind of dead-eyed look, like the lights were on but nobody was home. After that the counselor responded to the shaman's every command: walk, smile, jump. He was like a puppet, and then they just released him and off he wandered into the night. The cops eventually found him and brought him home. According to newspaper reports he seemed fine, if a little confused. He certainly didn't talk about any ceremony. A couple of days later, according to the same reports, he got a phone call at home. After the call his wife saw him calmly walk into the kitchen, pick up a knife, and stab himself in the throat. Jesus. Fun story, Benoit. Way to lighten the mood, I said with the mental image in my head. So yeah, I didn't see exactly what we saw in the tunnels before, but I have seen some weirdly similar shit, Benoit said as he pressed down harder on the accelerator. We both sat in silence as he drove. After about an hour of driving we turned off the small road onto an even smaller dirt track. Reeds grew high at the side of the road. The guy really did lived in a swamp. Only a mile or so now, Benoit informed me as we bounced uncomfortably over the dirt road. As soon as he spoke we saw a small column of smoke rising in the distance. Tell me that's not his house? I said, half hoping. His house is the only one on this road, Benoit replied with fear in his voice as we approached. The dirt track turned to gravel as we approached. It was a small old plantation house. While I say small, it was small as plantation houses go, but still imposing. It was also very much ablaze. Thick plumes of black smoke were bellowing from the house, but the fire had not fully engulfed it. The fire had clearly been started recently. The car came to a halt on the grass lawn. We both hopped out. Benoit ran to the front porch. There was a barrel of rainwater near a gutter pipe. He dunked his head into it, drenching himself. He pulled his soaked t-shirt up over his mouth and nose. Are you kidding? We're not going in there, I roared. I'm not leaving the guy to burn to death. I got him into this mess, Benoit replied, his voice muffled by the t-shirt. I hesitated for a second and then, following Benoit's lead, dunked my head into the barrel. We both stood at the doorway, our faces covered, ready to enter. This isn't going to end well, I thought as Benoit kicked in the door. The heat was incredible. Smoke was filling the house. Luckily those old houses had pretty high ceilings. The smoke sat like an ominous black blanket above our heads. Soon it would fill the house and our lungs if we weren't careful. Benoit lead the way. His study is in the back. That's where he works, Benoit shouted through his t-shirt. We made our way quickly to the study. Benoit felt the door to check if it was hot. It's warm. Keep to the side, Benoit said as he quickly kicked the door and then ducked to the left of the door frame. Luckily there was no backdraft. The room was ablaze, but it hadn't burned up all the oxygen. Flames engulfed the ceiling and licked the walls. Then we spotted him. The professor lay dead in his chair, head slumped on his large wooden desk, a pool of blood pouring from his throat, and 2 shards of glass protruding from his eye sockets.
I'm sharing the story because I was forced to sit through it during New Year's Eve dinner, and I'm so freaked out and goddamn itchy that I need to get it out of my system. I'm sure some of you are going to breeze on by this little tantrum here and go right to the meat of the story because you're thinking, hey, I've got a strong stomach. Well, go for it. Boring stuff out of the way, he was drafted, and since he was short and skinny, he was a perfect tunnel rat. Those were the guys who wriggled their way through the ridiculously narrow tunnels the Viet Cong used to transport personnel and weapons, set booby traps, and all that. And when I say narrow, I mean narrow. Here's a pic. So, Gramps was wriggling around in a tunnel one day and a few bad things happened. First, the 2 other people with him got killed by a solitary VC while they were standing around the hole. Being a few feet underground and about 20 feet through meant Grandpa couldn't see who attacked them or know if anyone survived. He later learned he was the only one left alive, but he assumed the VC attacker would soon start throwing grenades into the tunnel and he'd be done for. After a few minutes with no sign of any incoming attack, Grandpa breathed a sigh of relief and started moving forward again. A little while later, though, it started pouring rain. The tunnel began to fill with water. Now, in an unfinished, unsupported tunnel like he was in, a rainstorm usually meant death for a tunnel rat. He'd heard horror stories from the squadmates who'd lost others underground, never to be seen again. He figured he'd be another. But he wasn't going to go out without a fight. He crawled forward. With him, he carried a small pistol and a Fulton flashlight. Originally, he'd been sent down to ambush some VC soldiers who were thought to be hidden in one of the tunnel's larger chambers. He'd crawl through, surprise them, blow their brains out, and wiggle his way back out. At least, that's how his first 3 tunnel trips had gone. This one, his 4th, wasn't going so well. The tunnel narrowed as he crawled. Ahead of him, he heard rushing water. He thought it might mean the main chamber was nearby. He was wrong. The sound was the muddy ground above him sloshing downward, sealing the tunnel ahead. This is where he started to panic. He knew he wasn't particularly deep in the ground, maybe 2.5 feet, but if he didn't start clawing upward through the ground really fast, he'd be a dead man. So he clawed. His fingernails tore off and his hands got cut up really bad, but he was able to get part of his arm and face out of the mud. He was unable to move any farther. His lower back was pushed hard into the dirt and the angle had him bent into an elongated U-shape. His legs were trapped. Above him, a square foot of light shone through where he'd escape if he weren't stuck. He knew if it started to storm again, he'd drown. But the rain didn't come. Insects did. Ants were first. Luckily, they weren't the big red ones everyone over there was terrified of. The ones with the bite that felt like you got shot. These were tiny black ones, but there were lots of them. He assumed when the tunnel flooded, they were driven from their homes. Now they crawled over his scalp, face, and neck. They didn't bite, but they tickled and itched. Those which found their way onto his lips were licked off and swallowed. He figured he'd be going a while without food. After a while, the ants lost interest. Flies became a problem, though. To see why, you need to know the position in which he was stuck. The twisted, awkward angle of his body left one arm stretched out in front of him, but his shoulder and upper back were immobile, so, he had a bit of movement in his upper arm, wrist, and hand, but anything below his elbow might as well have been paralyzed. Why is this relevant? Because his armpit was exposed. Not by much, maybe an inch of clearance, but that was more than enough for the flies. And they were very attracted to the warm, moist pit. Over the course of an hour, 20 to 30 fat, brownish-black flies dove into his right armpit. They stayed for a little while, usually no more than 6 or 7 at a time, before they flew away. Of course, while inside, they bit. The pain was sharp and awful, he said. It reminded him of that deep, pinching itch of the horse flies on the beach near where he grew up. And he couldn't stop them from doing anything. He just ground his teeth. As the sun went down, the flies started to lose interest and flew away. He knew a few stayed nestled inside because he felt them moving against the thick hair of his armpit, but the majority had gone. Now just mosquitoes remained to torment him with their endless bites and bottomless gullets. Somehow, he slept. From the moment the sun came up, new insects visited him. Of all the massive, tropical bugs he'd seen in Vietnam, he was grateful to have so far avoided the giant centipedes he'd heard about. Massive, angry things as long as a man's forearm and as thick as a bottle of beer. One of his more sadistic squadmates hid one in the bunk of another poor bastard. It bit his feet and toes 10 times before he could even jerk himself out of the bed. Grandpa hated even the tiny ones that he sometimes found in his basement back home, so the thought of those big ones made his blood run cold. This is what they look like. God help you, 5 minutes after he opened his eyes to the morning light, one of them crawled onto his hand and wrapped itself around his wrist. He was too horrified to move. The little movement he had in his hand and wrist might have been enough to fling it away, but he didn't want to take a chance. So, he waited. Apparently the thing liked Grandpa, because it remained on him for well over an hour before Grandpa couldn't take the stress anymore. He tried to grab the bug in his fist. The moment he started moving, the thing began to bite. Grandpa was able to get a good grip on it and squeezed as hard as he could. The centipede broke in half in his hand and sent disgusting juices down his arm. The two pieces of its body dropped into the hole. The front part still had some life in it, and as it died, it bit Grandpa on the nose and lips until he was forced to take its head in his teeth and kill it. He described the taste to us, but I'm just not going to write it out. Yeah, it was that awful. The rest of that day was spent suffering as flies swarmed around the carcass of the centipede. They couldn't get enough of it. The juice on his arm, too, which had dribbled all the way down into his armpit, was also like the nectar of the gods for the flies. More and more of them flew in and out of his armpit. He could tell more were staying within its moist confines, too. The pinching and itching and tickling sensations were occasionally more torturous than the nastily swollen centipede bites. Ants, too, noticed of the centipede corpse. This time, the little black ones weren't the only variant. The red monsters with the hideous jaws had arrived. Grandpa lucked out, though. They were more interested in killing the smaller ants than bothering him. He did say one of them bit the corner of his left eye, but the pain was much less than what the wimps at camp were always bitching about. Back in hell, it had started to rain. This was a mixed blessing for Grandpa. The majority of bugs scurried away to find higher ground, but he was fairly certain the hole was going to fill with water and he'd drown. Well, it didn't, and he didn't. He even got a chance to drink some rainwater. He'd been without any real food or water for well over 24 hours at that point, so he was grateful to swallow the few tablespoons worth he managed to get. There was a scary moment when the dirt below his hips shifted downward and he thought he was going to fall and get buried. Again, he lucked out. The shift was minor. He'd been pinned in that strange, elongated U-shape for a while, and having a tiny bit of the pressure relieved around his groin was definitely a plus. He was able to wiggle his hips and butt a little and figured there was maybe an inch or two of clearance in that area, but nothing that allowed him to get any hope of crawling out. He drifted to sleep at dusk and was woken up before dawn by severe pain in his armpit. He'd known all along that flies were busy damaging his skin and probably eating it. He was resigned to that fact. As long as it wasn't another centipede, he wasn't going to complain. But this pain was new and it was exquisite. The bites came much more frequently and he felt a lot of them moving around. That pain, despite its severity, was dwarfed by what came next. Let me just make this known, I don't want to tell this part of the story. Just thinking about it makes me cringe. But god damn it, it's essential to his experience. And I'm sorry in advance for you having to read it. I'll try to make it quick. The shifting downward of the dirt was the result of an ant colony collapsing. A big one. All the ants came up out of the wreckage and had been hanging out on the surface of the dirt right below Grandpa's hips, but as he started to settle into the new position overnight, the ants became agitated and swarmed him. And by him, I mean his crotch. Maybe the only thing that equaled the level of horror at the table as he talked about ants crawling into his penis and rectum was how hard my grandmother laughed as he told it. "You've gotta get really close to see the scars," she exclaimed, as tears of laughter ran down her cheeks. My brother Derek's new girlfriend turned green and left the table with Derek hurrying after her. Grandma and Grandpa shared a kiss and he continued with the story. With ants up his dick and asshole and flies building a housing project in his armpit, Grandpa suffered through the next 2 days in a haze of pain and fear. The lack of food and water had taken a toll on him. This, he told us, was somewhat helpful. The pain grew less acute as his consciousness waxed and waned. A tarantula wandered into the hole and Grandpa was able to bite its abdomen in half and suck out what was inside. This, of course, attracted more flies, but there was nothing he could do about it. If he didn't get some food and water in him, he'd die. His survival instinct was still intact despite all the trauma. A couple more days went by and he blurrily realized he'd been stuck for about a week. The rainfalls and insect pulp had kept him hydrated just enough to stay alive. His armpit was numb all the way down to the last rib on his right side. Flies were ignoring everything else and just going straight in and out of the pit. The adventurous ants had lost interest after a while, but every so often he felt a nasty pinch on one incredibly sensitive area or another. More time passed. Late one afternoon, he heard gunfire. He heard quite a bit while he was stuck, but it was always off in the distance and too far for him to get any hope that he'd be rescued. This time, though, it was very close. He was overwhelmed with a sense of hope which was tainted by the concern that he'd be found by the wrong side. But, to his astonishment, it wasn't the VC who he heard shouting after all the gunfire. Grandpa started waving his arm with the tiny bit of movement he could muster. He heard someone yell, "Hey, there's an arm over here." Grandpa yelled back incoherently and was soon greeted by the sight of a US soldier peering down at him. It took him and his squadmates 10 minutes to dig Grandpa out of the hole. Someone radioed their position and after some unknown amount of time, a helicopter landed in a nearby clearing. Grandpa was loaded onto a stretcher and they lifted off. A medic who was along for the ride cut off Grandpa's shirt and promptly threw up. When the rest of the soldiers in the chopper looked at what the medic had seen, a few of them also rained puke down from the side of the aircraft. A few days after being rescued, Grandpa woke up in a hospital. Not one on the base, either, one in the US. He had no idea how he got there. Once he was rescued, he passed out and slept for almost 36 straight hours. Some people thought he was in a coma until some poor medic tried to wake him up and Grandpa said piss off and knocked the guy out with a single shot to the chin. Now awake, the doctors told Grandpa the extent of his injuries. Aside from the severe dehydration, he was absolutely riddled with infected bites. The ones on his more sensitive areas weren't much cause for alarm, despite their unpleasantness. It was the bigger bites that were much more of a concern. The one from the red ant was the worst and for a while the doctors worried he'd lose the eye. His lips and nose had terrible swelling from the infected centipede bites. Even though all those bites were awful, he could have recovered in a few weeks and would have been back in the tunnels soon after. But his armpit was why he was sent home. Botflies are a type of insect which lay their eggs inside flesh. Here's a picture of them in some poor bastard, and again, I'm sorry to do this to you. Until Grandpa's experience, no one knew they even had them in Vietnam. But apparently they do. The underside of his right arm all the way down to nearly his hip was completely reshaped into horrible cavities for their larvae. The doctors wouldn't operate, saying the only way to excise them was to let them gestate, and at a certain point, suffocate them with adhesive tape so they'd crawl to the surface. It took another few weeks, but that's what happened. Grandpa regaled us with the story of how he personally gave birth to 313 botfly larvae. Then he lifted up his shirt to show us the pock-marked skin. No one said much after that. He was done with the story and after shoveling a slice of fruit cake into his mouth, he and Grandma left. They laughed all the way to the door. I don't really know what else to say. So yeah. That's Grandpa.
I can't fully remember this, but all of my family members have confirmed this story is true. Be me. Pretty young at the time, less than 5. Apparently on multiple occasions walked into the kitchen and would ask who the man standing there was. We lived with my grandparents and I would say that it was my grandpa. It was not. Parents said that nobody was there, but I was adamant that someone was there. Later find out that this man was my great-grandpa and my grandpa greatly resembled him. Find out my great-grandpa practiced witchcraft and shit in the early to mid-1900s. Did my great-grandpa come to visit me?